The interrogation room was dimly lit by a cold, desolate light. Héctor sat across from a police officer, whose expression was serious and distant. The officer had heard the story, but he didn't seem impressed. Héctor, with his voice trembling from exhaustion and fear, began recounting the events.
Héctor, what exactly happened there?
The detective asked in a firm tone, though there was a hint of disbelief.
They weren't human, at least not in the end.
Héctor replied, staring at the officer with wide, haunted eyes.
Something took over them, or something that pretended to be them.
And how do you know that? What makes you think everything you saw was real?
Before Héctor could answer, the door opened, and a tall man with an icy expression and an imposing presence entered. The officer gave him a quick glance as if awaiting his signal. The tall man made a motion with his head, and the officer, without a word, left the room. The tall man sat down across from Héctor, and after a long silence he spoke.
Héctor, tell me, what did you really see?
Héctor arrived in Greece seeking a fresh start. He was 28, and while his life in his home country had been quiet, he felt that something was missing. He was determined to save enough money to travel and explore the world. A friend had recommended a shared house in a small town by the sea, where he could rent a cheap room. The house was old, with stone walls that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Mrs. Carolus, the landlady, greeted him with a rigid smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had gray hair tied up in a tight bun, and her pale skin contrasted with the warm, sunny air outside.
Welcome, Héctor. Here, we value peace, so I hope you enjoy the tranquility of our home.
Her voice was calm but empty, as if she were reciting a script that wasn't her own. Héctor found something unsettling about her, but he chalked it up to the discomfort of being in a new place. Inside the house, he was introduced to the other tenants. Petros, a robust man in his 40s, and his wife Aliki, who was 38. They seemed friendly, but something about their forced smiles made Héctor uneasy. There was also a university student named Nikos, a 23-year-old who seemed a little restless, as if he too noticed something strange about the house. That night, after their first dinner, Héctor tried to sleep, but rest eluded him. From his room, he could hear footsteps coming up and down the stairs, a constant creaking that seemed to come from the very walls. He woke up several times but couldn't explain the sounds. He thought perhaps it was the wind or just the noises of an old house. The next morning, Héctor found Aliki in the kitchen. She looked at him and smiled, but her smile was distant, vacant. It was as if she were waiting for him to say something, but not knowing how to respond.
Good morning, Héctor. I hope you slept well.
Aliki said, but her tone was flat, emotionless. As Héctor prepared his breakfast, he noticed that Aliki's height had subtly changed. She seemed taller and her figure appeared thinner. Her movements were strange, almost as if she were imitating someone but doing it wrong. That night, after a seemingly normal day, Héctor woke up thirsty. He went downstairs to the kitchen and found Aliki again, but this time she was standing motionless, staring out the dark window. Something was off. Aliki's figure was now even taller than before, her neck longer, her body stretched and contorted in an unnatural posture.
It's late to be up.
Aliki whispered. Her words didn't match her usual tone, and her smile had become something Héctor couldn't recognize. Terrified, Héctor slowly backed away and hurried back to his room. The door, when he shut it, felt heavier than ever. That night, he lay awake, listening to the footsteps that continued to echo through the house. Something was wrong. The next morning was even more unsettling. Héctor woke up to find that Nikos had disappeared. His room was exactly as he had left it, his bed unmade, but there were no signs that he had left. Héctor went to speak to Mrs. Carolus, but she calmly replied that Nikos had left early to explore the city. However, something about her words didn't add up. Héctor had heard noises during the night, and he couldn't have just left without him noticing. In Nikos' room, Héctor found a journal full of strange symbols and cryptic notes. One page contained the words, "Don't trust their eyes. They are shadows disguised as humans." A chill ran down Héctor's spine. That night, while Petros and Aliki seemed more restless than usual, Héctor tried to tell the others about his discovery, but their responses were met with empty smiles. No one seemed to understand the fear he felt. The fourth day was the worst so far. That night, Héctor woke up, startled by whispers coming from the hallway. Cautiously, he peeked out the door and saw Petros and Aliki standing still, motionless. Both were facing forward, but their bodies were in unnatural positions. Their arms were extended at impossible angles, and their heads were slowly turning, as if their necks could stretch. The voices murmuring in an unknown language filled the air. Héctor felt dizzy as though those words were influencing his mind. Mrs. Carolus appeared at the end of the hallway, watching them with a satisfied smile. The three of them turned and walked toward the kitchen without looking back. That night, Héctor blocked the door with a chair, convinced that his housemates were not human, but something much more dangerous. Yet the noises continued incessantly as though the house itself were alive, watching him. Héctor knew he couldn't stay there any longer. Desperate, he decided to investigate the house's basement, a place no one seemed to go. When he descended the stairs, the air felt dense, heavy, as though he were entering another world. At the bottom, he found a strange room, its walls covered in symbols carved into the stone. In the center, there was a circle of extinguished candles surrounding a grotesque figure etched into the floor. It was a representation of humans twisted in a macabre dance, trapped in an endless loop. Suddenly, Petros, Aliki, and Mrs. Carolus appeared, blocking the exit. Petros and Aliki's bodies were contorted, their faces now twisted into macabre smiles, their eyes empty, reflecting nothing.
We knew you'd figure it out, and we always have room for one more,
said Mrs. Carolus, her voice fading into an eerie whisper. Héctor bolted toward the door and with one final effort, managed to escape the house. But he knew he had not escaped what he had seen. Back in the interrogation room, Héctor was exhausted. The tall man who had entered the room earlier showed him a series of photographs, and Héctor, with a growing sense of dread, recognized Petros and Aliki among the images. The tall man smiled and nodded, taking the photographs and tucking them into his jacket.
Thank you, Héctor,
he said, standing up. Before Héctor could get up, the man sprayed something in his face. Héctor slowly began to lose consciousness. In the haze of sleep, he heard the tall man speaking to the officer.
The targets have been confirmed. Prepare for the next phase.
And then, everything faded into darkness.